Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Bite podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nina Livesey, and we're going to be discussing a bit about her upcoming book, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. Although by the time I release this video, her book would already have came out. I'll have the link to the affiliate link in the description below to purchase Professor Nina Livesey's book. So thank you for joining me today, Professor Livesey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me.
Second time, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's in person.
This is nice.
Good to see you in person, yeah.
It's great to see you too.
Yeah. So I'd like to start us off with what led you to postulate the authenticity of these 7 epistles? Really, I should also ask, really, in context of that, what led you to believe they are inauthentic? So what convinced you that they were authentic initially, and then start us on the journey of what led you to thinking the opposite?
Yeah. Well, just my training, and it's the same training that goes on today in undergraduate courses on the Bible. These 7 letters are the only letters that are authentic of Paul. I learned all of that in graduate school. That's just been the common lore for, 50 years, maybe longer. So I totally embrace that. I've written papers on that. There's a paper that is seen very often now, Women in the Authentic Letters of Paul. And I've totally embraced the 7 authentic letters of Paul. So I've transformed. And I do not think those are authentic letters. I should just say that right out. I don't think any of the Pauline letters are authentic of Paul, and I date them later, but we'll probably get to that in a minute or two. Mm-hmm. So, but what led me to it, and there was a trajectory, a kind of history, my scholarship, my experiences, it all led to a new look. And the first thing I'd like to say is this work on rhetoric, and you and I already talked a little bit about that. I have a second book out on Galatians and the rhetoric of crisis. I wrote that, and I say this because I think it also plays a role in my ability to rethink. I wrote that letter out of the country, or the book out of when I was out of the country, and I was able to sit in a place away from home and really think about, in detail, the rhetorical moves that, at that time in my book, Paul was making. So I looked at it very closely, and I compared Paul to both Cicero and Demosthenes, professional orators and rhetors, and more sophisticated, really, than what you see in the Pauline letters. But with those other 2 authors in hand, and then, as I said, kind of re-looking at Galatians just through that rhetorical lens, I could see the depth of the construction of the so-called autobiographical sections, the emotion aspect of it. Again, I'm comparing, and then I'm also getting pretty heavy into rhetorical theory because I had to back up everything I was saying. So I was still in France and looked at rhetorical theory there, and one thing in that rhetorical theory really influenced me very heavily is rhetoric was used to actually do construction of texts. It's not rhetoric that kind of stands on top of literature and just goes along for the ride and enhances what you want to say. But rhetoric can actually be part and parcel of developing what you want to say, the whole cloth of it. So rhetoric constructs the truth, you might say. That made a big impression on me, the idea of how rhetoric works. And it does play out because in the rhetorical theory, rhetorical techniques, it is construction, even polemics. You can accuse your opponent of whatever you want. It's constructing them as an other that is not morally upright. Okay, maybe the person was morally upright, but with your polemics, you're creating that situation. So you can see in rhetorical theory, they're learning about polemics. They're also learning how to speak in the voice of somebody else. So all of these are constructive techniques, and all of that played a role in my thinking. So then gradually that led me to really believe that these letters were something other. I could then go from the internal look to what about the letters themselves? Maybe these letters then are not what they purport to be, genuine letters. So I made that jump tentatively. But then, at the same time, and this is after I got back to the U.S., I was in communication with a close classicist friend and colleague, and she kind of pulled me aside at a meeting and said, it's likely that Pauline scholars or even biblical scholars are, in the way they assess those 7 letters as authentic, they're likely overconfident in that because authorship is very difficult to assess. And yet, and it's true of all the scholarship, those letters are definitely authentic. They're just taken as authentic. So once she said that, I thought, I am going to research how did that authentication process come about. So I talk about that in the book. And it's flimsy. I'll give you a heads up. So that is also confirming my suspicions about the letters. So now the letters, I'm already skeptical. They could be something other than genuine letters. So then I think I just fell into, because I don't remember anybody handing me the book, but I used Patricia Rosenmeyer's Ancient Epistolary Fiction, her 2001 book, and that was just fascinating and eye-opening to me. And her book and other scholars of that ilk, especially her book, became my constant companion as I was writing this book that's about to be published. She opened my world to fictional letters and how they can be used. And I was then, and I remain, completely fascinated by what you can do with a fictional letter. The rhetorical use of a letter, the letter itself, and that's Rosenmeyer, that book. She talks a lot about how fictional letters can be used for all kinds of things. So then I had all my pieces in place to put my thesis out there.
When do you date the Pauline epistles, before or after the composition of the Gospels?
Well, once I realized, or I was getting quite convinced that the letters were not genuine, something important happened there, because those authentic letters are in the mid-1st century. They're dated there. They're placed there.
Right.
So once I decided they're not genuine, I could let go of that mid-1st century. And it was an easy move to make, I'll tell you, because in fact, there was a line in the book, and I think I removed it. There was nothing that held me to saying these letters absolutely need to be in the mid-first century. Nothing held me there. The way that the dating of mid-first century comes about is internal, the internal references of the letter. So it's insular. And we all know that authors can write about Babylonia and be in the 20th century. So you're not going to say the composition of that piece took place in the Babylonian Empire. So we know that internal dating, it cannot be the final determiner of a text of literature, and the same is true for letters. So once I got freed up of that mid-first century, then I could look at some of the references in the letter, and of course the Paul of the letter knows about the Passion, Jesus Christ on the cross, crucified. And then for me, the knowledge of that would have come from the Gospels. So that made me say or think, and I still do think, the letters come after the Gospels. And more importantly, Acts. Acts plays a role in my whole thesis as well. So post-Gospels, the letters come after the Gospels.
So you would therefore...
Or at least one Gospel. At least one Gospel. Maybe not all the Gospels, but at least one Gospel.
Well, either way, that's how you would explain why Paul, or the person claimed to be Paul, or persons in these letters, how they seem to know a Passion account, how they make imply to it. So rather than hypothesizing a pre-Pauline source, one of the Gospels or all of them are the source or sources for this pretender or so-called Paul. So Acts, what do you make of Acts in relation to Paul's epistles? It is often said that Acts is independent of Paul's epistles, one of the reasons being because it never mentions Paul's letters. Or is it because the letters hadn't been written yet when Acts was composed?
Well, the short answer, I think that the letters, I'm really feeling stronger and stronger daily almost on this, that the letters need to follow Acts. They're derivative of Acts. So I think what we have is there's at least one gospel. It may be Marcion's gospel. And then we have Acts. And then we have the letters. I think that's how it needs to go that way. So why... We've known for a long time, at least in some circles, that Acts and the letters seem to know each other. But of course, the scholarship, because of this authentic letter paradigm and the letters being early, it had to be that Acts, in that scholarship that shows that Acts and the letters know each other, it always had to be that Acts knew of the letters, but it never fessed up that it knew of the letters. And there's been some very good scholarship by Bill Walker, for instance, his exegesis, almost scientific, detailed work to show that there's even linguistic parallels between Acts and the letters and certain incidents that really show that Acts, and in Walker's view, Acts must have known the letters in order to talk about various things like the Jerusalem incident and things like that. So, but one of the things, once you let go of that paradigm, then you start asking yourself, well, who's Paul? How do we get Paul. If they're not real letters, and there's no first century Paul who wrote those letters, then I had to ask myself, well, how do we get Paul? And that's where I turned to Acts. And Acts is very strategic with Paul. The first part of it is Saul, and then he has this transformation. Well, he has the transformation in Acts 9, where he still remains Saul. But then in Acts 13, when you see the conversion of this fellow Sergius Paulus, Saul also is called Paul. So I feel that we get Paul from Acts, and that's how we know of Paul. There's one other thing that I think works in alongside that notion of Paul coming from Acts, is Paul in the letters is very much Apostle Paul. How do we get Apostle Paul? Or why, you might ask, why would Paul call himself an apostle? And it's very intentional in Galatians, and as you know, I've worked a lot on Galatians. So why call yourself Apostle Paul if the whole idea of an apostleship is not known? And in the older paradigm, the 7 authentic letters, early, preceding Acts, preceding even Gospels, because now we're putting the Gospels a little bit later too. So the letters are supposedly the very first instances of New Testament texts. Well, why would someone call themselves an apostle if that, and I think that apostle has a theological overtones. It's not just a messenger, because there is a word apostle that just means a messenger, and it had an association with shipbuilding. But these letters aren't about shipbuilding. It's very theological in the opening. So why call yourself an apostle if there's no apostle even known? Why would I want to say I'm an apostle? Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? So that's another reason why I think you need a gospel with 12 apostles, but it's in Acts where the apostles really come alive and they carry things forward, right? So, and I think the letters are in friction, or you might say contention with Acts, because in Acts is careful to not really dub Paul an apostle. There's one verse in there that maybe suggests that he was an apostle, but I think it's a little dubious whether Paul and Barnabas are apostles. So,
well, it would seem like one way or another that I think you make an interesting point there, because regardless of Acts, like, okay, in that one little instance it does, but it doesn't accentuate the point too much. But then you get the epistles, which do. Either way is building over Acts, is your point. And I think it's very interesting, because I have wondered in the past, it's always creeped me out that Acts never mentions Paul's letters. Mm-hmm. And if Paul's letters were written before Acts, but the logic is Acts is independent of Paul's letters, then how do you know they existed before Acts? And even if they somehow did, where did Acts get its information from then? Mm-hmm. They hypothesize, as those I believe that will hypothesize different sources or a oral tradition, a convenient oral tradition. Exactly. I'm like, well, can you be sure about that tradition?
I know. I've seen that so much. It's the fallback. The other thing is epistolary scholarship again, and I go back to Rosenmeyer, because in my own mind I played around with this notion, which is first, Acts or the letters. But in epistolary scholarship, you need to have the character developed first before you have the letters attributed to the character. And that's repeated in pseudonymous letter collections, which is what I think this is. No one would bother reading letters of Paul unless Paul already existed. And that goes for fictive or factual characters. So Paul's got to be out there. Do you see what I mean? For these letters to have any agency or any effectiveness. There's one other thing that's occurred to me more recently that I've played with, which I think has some credence. It looks like even in Galatians, that autobiographical section, which I've worked on a lot, which Galatians 1, where you see Paul say, "You've no doubt heard of my persecution of Jesus groups, and I tried to kill them," or whatever. I think it's Galatians 1:13. And you just kind of read over that, and you just, with the old paradigm. But how would we have heard of that? But if you say, well, yeah, I would have heard about it if I knew Acts. So what I'm thinking is, because pseudonymous letters are really, the target of those are not the addressee, the internal addressee, they're external readers. So it looks like that statement is a nod to external readers, the buddies out there who might be hearing this letter or reading that letter. They're the creators. They're the gospel creators. They're the Acts creators. They're in this group of literary producers. So they have Paul say, "You've no doubt heard." It's like a nod to the guy in the audience who, read that in Acts. That's how I'm reading that now. Probably needs more development, but so I just think Acts has the priority.
Do you believe the Pauline epistles tell us anything reliable about the historical Paul, even if none of them are by Paul himself?
Well, I've kind of indirectly answered that.
Yeah, that's true.
And the thing about Acts, and there's been some work done on this, where Acts plays around with names. There's many characters who end up with multiple names, and it's a literary technique to show a transformation of some kind. Paul becomes missionary to the Gentiles, and so his name kind of takes on, he gets this Roman name. So there's this playing around with names. So in the scholarship, it's funny, when you read Acts, we hear about the author playing around with names, but somehow when it talks about the name Paul, that author doesn't play around with that name. There is so much wrapped around Paul, the historicity of Paul, and the letters being genuine, that even though good scholars know about Acts and how it uses names, how it creates narratives, it doesn't want to touch Paul. So I think that's a little strange too, and I think we need to see Paul as part of the character mix in Acts. It's a long way around of getting away from that exact answer of historical.
Why do you think the letters were composed?
Well, it's here that I think that if there was some genius involved in this early Christian literature, it was the composition of letters. And that's another thing that one can think about. why does the New Testament have all these letters? Where you think about the Hebrew Bible, there aren't any standalone letters. There's one in what we call intertestamental works, this letter of Jeremiah. So it's very interesting that you would have Paul take on agency with letters. And why I think it's genius is because of the power of the letter genre itself. Maybe one of the most important points here is a letter seems real. A letter, if you get a letter somehow, it has importance in and of itself. It seems personal. You can put anything into a letter. You can, make moral advice. It's infinitely flexible on what you can put into a letter. It's very interesting, the rhetorical value of letters. And so if you're going to say something, you Corinthians ought to do X, Y, or Z, you could write a treatise about it, and it would be rather dry. But if you send a letter, and an external reader, a secondary reader, is looking at that, it automatically creates interest, because that reader sees, it looks over the shoulder and it's seeing, oh, Paul, this authoritative figure, who becomes authoritative because he's a letter writer, because that's another thing that letters do. You see over the shoulder advice given to somebody else, and that's also attractive to readers. It's much more lively than reading a treatise. So that's where I think some of the genius takes place, is to adopt the letter genre. And this was already being done. So I'm not making this up. We already have it with Seneca and his moral epistles. There's 140 of these things. They're all fictitious letters to somebody that he creates, this character, Lucilius. And all of the advice that he wants to give to Lucilius is in the medium of a friendly letter. They're very attractive to read that as an external person. So the entirety of Stoic philosophy is in letters. And it keeps the conversation going. It's, as I said, lively and interesting.
Do you think the historical Paul wrote anything at all that might have been lost and could have been replaced by all these forgeries instead?
I wouldn't call the letters forgeries. I would kind of flip the script on that and say the letters become important because they're ascribed to Paul, and Paul is important. Paul is very important for the Christian tradition. I mean, we all know that. And how does he become important? Through Acts. So the fact that you have letters, even if they're fictitious, I think that they're important. They're not forgeries. I wouldn't use the word forgeries. Okay. And I don't know if there would be. It seems unlikely to me, but I don't know, and there's so much more to learn myself, and who knows what's going to be discovered. But I think from what we have, this Apostle Paul, and then he takes on a new persona with the letters. Intentionally, somebody really wanted to take in new directions.
In my closing question, do you think anything, let me rephrase, so do you think that the book of Acts is the most reliable text we have about the historical Paul, despite whatever goals it might be having to try to perhaps embellish or change details?
I don't find Acts to be historically reliable. I find Acts to be literarily reliable. Acts puts out the narrative. So it's valuable in the narrative world. But, and now I'm not saying anything new. Many scholars would contest the historical reliability of Acts. And I guess I go far with that. I think it's a constructed narrative. So I'm sorry about the historical Paul. You've asked me about the historical Paul a couple of times. And I don't know, Paul is an important person, right? So I don't know if the historical value is what's the most important thing. In fact, if you say Paul is historical, then I think you've got a problem, because then what happens to this person? Because everything else that succeeds Acts, as we think of it, as apocryphal literature, and Paul shows up in some of that literature. So what would have happened to that person? We have no history. The whole history of anything that might have been historical, nobody has any history of it. It doesn't exist. So it stops. And I don't know that there was a history there. So there's a conceptual problem with that.
So you're not sure Paul existed?
Right.
As we continue to discuss her book, now that her book is actually out as of this recording, it's called Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. And I'll have the link in the description below to purchase the book, and also in the pinned comment. Okay, so what led you to reassess the authenticity of these 7 epistles, often held to be genuinely Pauline by the consensus of scholars? Right.
It is a shift. It's a biggish shift, actually. And what happened was a gradual process, and as I mentioned a little bit in the previous interview, I had worked very intensely on, especially the letter of Galatians, from a rhetorical perspective, really digging in deeply into how the author was trying to persuade, and it was a comparative study between Cicero and Demosthenes and the letter of Galatians, who I assumed at the time was Paul. So I was dealing with who I thought was Paul. So that all that study puts you very much in the mind of the author, you might say, behind the text. So that was, I was already there trying to see what is this author doing. And I think that really led me on this path that I'm currently on, putting myself in the shoes of the author. So that was the first move that I made, you might say. And once you are in that, the shoes of the author, one of the questions that you tend to ask is, how did this author learn all of this stuff? Right. What kind of an author is this? And of course, I'm comparing Paul, at the time I thought it was Paul, to orators, very well-known orators who certainly knew what they were doing, Demosthenes and Cicero. So I'm already, you might say, elevating the author of Galatians into a well-educated person. That already became very clear to me by 2016 when that previous book came out that we talked about before, actually, in our first interview. But then after, and this is gradually, it didn't come to me all at one time, that it wasn't Paul. I had no reason not to think of Paul, because when you think of all the scholarship, no scholarship really is saying it's not Paul. Those letters are fixed, you might say, as authentic.
Right.
But gradually I started to question whether or not you could say Paul was the author. And I think it was because of so much strategy that I saw. I thought, is it really Paul the author? Is Paul actually the author? But it was gradual. And I started this current book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, in 2018. So by then, I already wanted to explore. And so it started out as an explore, really, on authenticity, because I was asked, well, how do scholars, how can scholars be so sure that these letters are authentic? And that then put more questions in my mind. And I thought, well, I ought to research this. I didn't know this. So that's how this whole book started. And the authenticity process, the way these 7 letters are assessed as being authentic, is very weak. The criterion were weak, the arguments were weak, and so very soon I was able to see that this authentic perspective was crumbling. So then I kept moving on more and more to see what more could be discovered. And what are these letters then?
Do you believe the Pauline epistles tell us anything reliable about the historical Paul, even if none of them are by Paul himself?
I think the short answer is no, and I'm going to get to a little bit more of that later on, I think, with you. But one of the first questions I asked myself on this so-called authentic perspective that focuses so much on the historicity question, which is what you've just asked me, the historicity of the letters and the historicity of Paul. One of the early questions I asked myself was, were these letters always thought of as historical and the historical Paul? To be honest, it's hard to answer that directly, but you can indirectly get the answer to that question by seeing, and I struggled with this in the book, and where I end up is on the question of interest. What were people who looked at these letters interested in? Right now we're interested in history, we're interested in the Corinthians, let's say, and that leads us to this scholarship on the history of Corinth. So that historical question is very much now, but were those kinds of historical questions there originally, or maybe closer to when those letters would have been written? Maybe not exactly, the next day or the next year, but within 50 years or even less of when those letters were written. What was the interest in these letters? And that was eye-opening for me too, because you don't see so much, you don't see anything about the town of Corinth or Thessalonica, what Paul is up to. You don't see those kinds of things emerging in the writers who are looking at those letters. And I'm talking Irenaeus, Tertullian, Ptolemy even. What they're looking at is they're all mining the letters in a way. Right now we're mining them for history, but they were mining them too, and they're mining them for theological questions. So that historical question was off the radar, out of the radar, I think. And it was theology that was of interest. Now, let me add something else here.
Sure.
So the fact that the theology is of interest, I think, is important because it shows, or it showed me, that once those letters are out there, once there's a letter of Paul, they became important. I use the word authoritative, I use the word scripture-like, but somehow those letters of Paul became important. Not for history, as I said, but more for theology, that theological perspectives. Paul says this. No, Paul says that. Paul says there's one God. No, Paul says there's two gods. You know, these kinds of questions. And they need those letters. And from an early point, they need the letters. I think that's interesting, too.
Is 2 Corinthians 11:32-33 a reliable chronological anchor for Paul?
So that's a good question, and it really segues from your previous question. And I do look at that passage because it becomes, as you say, in the scholarship, well, there must have been Paul, there must have been a historical Paul because of a passage like this, 2 Corinthians. So let's see what that says. 2 Corinthians 11:32-33. So that reads, in Damascus, the governor, under King Aretas, guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, meaning Paul. But I, Paul, was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. That means the governor. He escaped. Paul is talking in the first person, or Paul, in the letter writer Paul is talking in the first person. So this King Aretas has been the historical marker to somehow prove Paul was there in the mid-1st century during this time of King Aretas, and I think it's this King Aretas IV, who was supposedly in charge of Nabatea, the region of Nabatea. Well, there isn't any, when you start to research King Aretas IV, you find out that the historicity of this fellow, King Aretas, is a little bit in doubt. There isn't anything on record, you might say, in the historical record, of him being in charge of that region at that time, or at any time, I don't think. So already there's some question about King Aretas and being in charge of a region around Damascus. That's already being questioned. But then the larger issue, and the larger issue here is, even if Aretas is there, and even if he is in charge and he has a governor, and all of that were absolutely true to the historical record, the only place that you see Paul, I would say character Paul, with the governor of King Aretas is there. There is no corroborating evidence for this. And it is frequent. It's a trend in writing, historical writing, literary writing, to drop names. So even though you have a historical person, and we do have historical people in the scriptural literature, you've got King Herod, you've got other people, you've got real places, it doesn't necessarily mean you can count on the historicity of the event at that time. It can just be a name dropper. And it does seem like that's the way it's working here. And the other thing that is a little bit of a giveaway of non-historical is this trope of Paul being let down a basket. That recurs in other scriptural passages. If you think of Rahab and the spies of Joshua, those spies are let down through a basket. Michal, who's one of the wives of David, she lets David, he's not quite king yet, it's in 1 Samuel, she lets David down fleeing from danger. So it really looks literary and not necessarily historical. I guess that's my answer on that one.
What is interesting is that Josephus does say that King Aretas III controlled Damascus. The problem is that Aretas lived a century prior to when Paul was supposedly active, which is curious. That's always bothered me. Because I wonder, did they mix up one Aretas with another? And if Paul did that, how does that work?
Right.
That's strange. In scholarship, they try to speculate about what does this mean, King Aretas controlling Damascus. Let's see.
It could have been a mix-up,
Yeah.
It could have just been King Aretas. It's Pauline scholarship that insists that it's King Aretas IV. It could have just been another reference to King Aretas that doesn't necessarily fit with when King Aretas lived or when he would have controlled Damascus. So, yeah, it's pretty loose. Those kinds of things are pretty loose.
And people can make, like even today when they do films, fictional films, and they have actors playing the role of people that actually lived, and they're meeting fictional people that never lived. This is something I want to throw in there. What do you make of Christus, who is said to have led some sort of rebellion in Rome around 49 CE that caused the expulsion of the Jews during Emperor Claudius's reign?
That's good. That's another, indirectly, that's another so-called historical anchor for getting Paul in the mid-1st century. That shows up in another passage that I discuss, which it's within Acts 18, chapter 18. And it's related because you see this Christus situation with regard to Aquila and Priscilla. And I have that also. So Acts 1-2, and this is getting into that Christus question that you just asked me. And so Acts 1-2, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Okay, so this is getting close to the Christus question. So that becomes an anchor. This Claudius had asked all Jews to leave Rome. So of course Claudius existed. There were Jews in Rome, so there's not an issue there. So how do we get Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome? So when scholars look for that, they land on Suetonius, who wrote, we think, around the time of Hadrian, so early 2nd century. He wrote this work called The Lives of the 12 Caesars, Claudius being one of the Caesars. And in that work, the part that's attributed to Claudius, again, Suetonius is claimed to have written it, it's there that you find this reference by Suetonius that Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome because Christus had started agitating. There was agitation by Crestus Christus. Then we wonder, we can look at the historicity of even the event. Did Claudius ask all the Jews to leave Rome? That's not necessarily corroborated by the historian Cassius Dio, who says that Claudius simply wanted Jews to stop congregating. So the Suetonius passage cannot necessarily be corroborated, that Claudius asked the Jews to leave, and that then would disqualify, you might say, that Crestus Christus, which is only cited there in this Suetonius passage. The other thing to mention about this Suetonius Lives of the 12 Caesars, from which we get the reference to Crestus Christus, is that has been classified as neither history nor biography. What is that? It's some kind of literary work. We don't know exactly how to classify it. Embellished work to embellish these 12 Caesars. It doesn't look terribly reliable for history, for one thing. But then to get a little bit closer to the Crestus Christus question, which is what has really piqued scholars, there must be Christians in Rome in the mid-1st century, which would lend more credibility to Paul the Christian in the mid-1st century, and more historicity to a lot of Christianity in the mid-1st century. The fact that this Suetonius passage looks suspicious, I think rules against that. And the other thing, when I look at it, well, I should say one scholar in particular really pushes back that saying that Crestus is a common name, it doesn't necessarily mean Christian. But let's for the moment say he was talking about, it was supposed to be Christus and he just misspelled it Crestus. And it was supposed to allude to Christians. That to me seems quite problematic for a Claudius to be writing about, because the first word Christian, so you get the notion of a Christian, is not until the 2nd century from any of our sources. So how would Claudius, in my reading of it, have any notion of Christus, Christ, Christian in the mid-1st century? It looks like it's influenced by Acts or something within Acts. Agitation by Jews. It looks suspiciously, to me, influenced by that.
When do you date the Pauline epistles?
Well, in the book, which you have the book and you've seen it, I am saying that they're in the mid-2nd century, and I've defaulted, you might say, to 144. And the way I came about that is because of Marcion. The first evidence that we have, and this, I kept researching the book. It led me to down one path, down another path. And then, well, when do we get these letters? And that's how I ended up with the Marcion, the centrality of Marcion, because that looks like it's the first actual evidence of the letters is with Marcion, who published 10 letters, and the publication came out at 144. So you can probably, before the publication, I'm assuming the letters came into existence. somehow right before. And I think they're pseudonymous. I think they're fictive. So I don't think they have anything to do with an historical first century Paul. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does.
Okay.
If you can expand on the connection between Marcion and the emergence of the 13 Pauline epistles?
Right. Well, as I said, I didn't start out with Marcion. I kind of fell into Marcion, and I get to Marcion in the very last chapter of the book. The chapter before goes into, because I was so interested in a letter, why a letter? Why would somebody pick up a letter? Why would you have Pauline theology in a letter? So that got me onto epistolary questions, which I spent a lot of time with. And finally, I needed to locate the letters. So I ended up, as I said, with Marcion as the first emergence. Marcion, though, the more I looked at Marcion and the more I came to the conclusion of authorial strategies, the need for an educated person, all of those questions that I already came to my mind in 2016 when I was doing the work on rhetoric, Marcion looked more and more attractive as a location for the development of the letters. Marcion, along with others, is attributed with a school. So a school setting fit that, my image of those letters as constructed. You need the outfitting of a school to do any kind of literary production, including letters. So Marcion looked more and more likely. Not only were the letters first, for sure, emerging with him, he is said to have a school. He's said to have the wealth. He likely had access to other materials. He clearly published. He wrote this work, which is no longer extant, these antitheses, for which he's known and much disparaged, I guess. He made contrasts between the law and the gospel. We don't know exactly what those antitheses were, although this Harnack tried to recreate the antitheses by kind of mirror reading some of the people who were writing about Marcion. So Marcion looked like the likely location for these letters. As I said, there's 10 letters with Marcion, and I do think that later on more letters were added. These pastorals were added, because you said, what about the 13 letters? Mm-hmm. 10 came with Marcion's collection, and then 3 more were added, and then Hebrews at some point was added as well.
And Ephesians replaced Laodiceans in the process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then these prologues are also attributed to Marcion. So Marcion is writing. He is doing some writing.
While many scholars dismiss the authenticity of 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, 1st, 2 Timothy, and Titus, they believe 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon are authentic. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the same person wrote those 7 separate letters, or is it multiple authors writing in the name of Paul?
Well, that's a good question, and I did ask myself that question. You know, I was schooled, and a lot of us, that those 7 letters were by the same hand and by the hand of Paul, who I now refer to as the Apostle Paul, as that's how the Paul in those letters is characterized, as Apostle Paul. I never actually answer that question. I subordinate the question. I don't know exactly the answer to it. I think you could say perhaps one person wrote those letters, but I also don't necessarily think Marcion himself necessarily wrote the letters. It's possible Marcion wrote some of the letters. But what I do say in the book is the school actually produced the letters. So some of the students in the school could have written those letters, the Marcionite students. And I can imagine, going back to the school setting, where Marcion is the teacher, maybe his main teachings are these antitheses, and he would ask his students, so how about writing a letter in the name of Paul that would promote this particular thesis of mine? And that could very well have been how these letters come about, where different students are asked to write a letter. And the other thing I'll say is ancient education knows full well and trains students on what's called speech and character, where students are asked to write in the name of someone. A letter is essentially that. It's a fictive letter. Write a letter in the name of, as though you were that person. And that can be easily a school exercise. So I can imagine something like that as the genesis of these letters.
What's interesting is that I believe it was Pseudo-Tertullian that says it was Curdon who produced this abridged Paul that Marcion would take over. And also the gospel as well. Just want to throw that in there real quick.
Okay.
Do you think the letters were composed before or after the Gospels and Acts have been written?
Okay. I think that at least one gospel needed to have been already there in the wind, maybe even in pre-published form before you have the letters. And I think the same about Acts. Acts really features large for my thesis. Acts as needing to be some form of Acts before the letters of Paul. In terms of the gospel being there before, I ran across this interesting passage in Tertullian, who read it that way, read Galatians, where you see euangelion, the word, which means gospel, in Galatians, where Paul is saying, these others don't have a gospel, I have the true gospel. In Pauline scholarship, that's interpreted primarily as the message, because they're not assuming there is a written gospel in the mid-first century. It's a message. Paul is promoting a message. I haven't seen super clearly what exactly that message is, and maybe it depends on which person you're talking to, exactly what Paul's gospel was. But Tertullian read it as a gospel text, which I found interesting, assuming then that by the time Galatians is written, there was this gospel, or maybe many gospels. So I found that very interesting. The other thing, there's all the concepts too. The letters, I'll mention this one thing. You've got Jesus, but with Christos in the letters, which this Christos is already a post-resurrection figure. The letters, just thinking chronologically of a story, you have a story of Jesus, and then the death of Jesus, the letters naturally and organically pick up at that secondary phase, don't they? With Christos, not with a Jesus person moving around, a living being, right? So that also, I think, is a clue that you need some kind of a passion to have taken place. I can also add the Paul of the letters is doing something, theologizing, you might say, about the implications of dying. Dying was suffering, of course, for this Jesus who becomes the Christos, the suffering one. But in the letter, you see the Apostle Paul saying, I suffer too. I suffer like this Christos. And that too seems secondary to me. So logically, I think you need to have that suffering and death, which shows up in the gospel, before you get the letters which do something with that. Take it another step, you might say. What more can I do with that? What's the implication of this dying on the cross for people?
So to expand on my question about Acts, that was part of the previous question. What do you make of Acts in relation to Paul's epistles? It is often said that Acts is independent of Paul's epistles. One of the reasons being because it never mentions Paul's letters, or it is because the letters hadn't been written yet when Acts was composed. Did Marcion's edition of Paul's letters post-date Acts?
Yes, I do think that we need we need Acts before you have the letters of Paul. And in the book, I spend a good deal of time talking about the name of Paul. I think you cannot have a letter of Paul, Apostle Paul, I'll use the word Apostle Paul, before you have the character Paul known. And I'll expand on that later in a minute, actually. And this is where I come to the centrality of Acts. Because in Acts, you have the character Saul, who in Acts 13 then takes on the name Paul. And that needs to happen before you have the letters of Paul. That character has to be made known. Paulus, it's really Paulus if you go to the Greek. In that Acts 13 chapter, there is another actual historical person. I don't know that there was a relationship between the Apostle Paul and this other person, historical person, whose name was Sergius Paulus, who was some kind of provincial Roman ruler of some kind. So it's just too coincidental that in a chapter in Acts where it's Paul's first miracle performed for this Roman official whose name happens to be Sergius Paulus, and then at that moment Saulus, or Saul, moves from Saulus to Paulus. And that very much fits one of the themes of Acts, where Acts is a name change expert, a specialist in name changes. A lot of the characters have two names, and it's thematic for the kind of the Jew-Gentile move and the ethnic move, and that fits very well where you have Paul, King Saul, and there's already been plenty of scholarship equating Saul, King Saul, and the Saul of Acts, very much a Jewish figure, to a Roman figure, Paulus. So I think you need Acts before you have that Apostle Paul of the letters. And the other thing that I think is important about Acts, which would precede the letters, is that notion of apostle. How could you have a letter? And as I said earlier, those letters were quickly taken up as scriptural by Irenaeus, Tertullian. They were seen as authoritative by an apostle Paul. How could they have been read as such if someone wouldn't have known who the Paul was? Who was this Paul? And who is an apostle? Why call yourself an apostle? You have to have that concept of an apostle out there. And that concept of apostle is made boldly, I would say, in the book of Acts, where it's Acts of the Apostles. The apostles are actually doing something. It's their book. What do the apostles do? The apostles became important. Poor Paul wasn't an apostle in Acts, but he sure is an apostle with the letters. I think that is partly what accounts for the popularity of the letters. But again, to get back to your question, I don't think you would have had those letters resonate without somebody knowing a Paul. I mean, you couldn't have had the letters of George, for instance. There's no George. that Paul had to be there, and it's Acts, I think, where we get the Paul character. It's also epistolary scholarship that brings me to that conclusion, and I can cite something of Patricia Rosenmeyer, on whose work I depended, her Ancient Epistolary Fictions. It's a 2001 monograph where she talks about ancient fictional letters. And she also, in that book, where she's talking about pseudonymous letter collections, says it is rare that you would have a letter collection of a person that is not already known. And she makes this one very interesting remark in her book. No self-respecting teacher in the ancient world would assign a student to write a letter based on what the baker's assistant in the house next door said when he found mice in the flour bins. Okay, so you need that. You would ask a student to write a letter of somebody who's known. There were letters of Plato, letters of Demosthenes. These are characters that are known somehow. And then you would tell your student, write a letter saying something about them. Okay, so you need the character. So epistolary scholarship gets me there as well.
And just to expand on what you said a moment ago about the comparison between King Saul and Paul the Apostle in Acts, Paul is kind of like reversing the role between David and King Saul in 2 Corinthians as he's fleeing from King Aretas, supposedly, just as David fled from Saul in the Old Testament. I just want to throw that in there.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And of course in Philippians, Paul is called a Benjamite, which King Saul is, according to the Old Testament. What kind of rhetoric is the real author, whoever that was, employing in writing Galatians, and why do you think the letters were written?
Yeah, that was why write a letter? That really piqued my interest, and it still is interesting. to me. When you think about the New Testament and you compare it to the Hebrew Bible, there are very few letters of books of the Hebrew Bible that are letters in the Hebrew Bible. We do have a letter of Jeremiah, but there's very few letters. There's embedded letters in the Hebrew Bible, but there's not a whole book there. But by contrast, you've got in the New Testament is primarily letters. So it's a great question, and it's still of interest of mine, and I think more work really needs to be done on this, picking up the notion of a letter. But I will say that letters lend themselves very nicely to teachings. There is something very handy about using a letter, and that I did, research on modern epistolary scholarship. So what you can think about is there's some what I could call givens about a letter. One is they seem casual, friendly, accessible. They also seem trustworthy, and they seem, again with trustworthy, real. So you have this medium that you could say is rhetorically quite powerful. Friendly, they lend themselves again to being very accessible. The other thing about a letter is you get the sense when you read a letter that the two parties know each other. So you're reading a letter secondarily. We're all reading the letters of Paul secondarily. And you see the Apostle Paul, let's say, addressing the Corinthians. Your thought, my thought, others, I would imagine, Paul, the Apostle Paul, knows the Corinthians. So already you can have that notion because of a letter. A letter allows the secondary reader to already see that there is a relationship established between the sender and the person being addressed, the addressee of the letter. So that is also very interesting. And these are all givens about letters. They're trustworthy. They have a reputation for being trustworthy, authentic, real. They come with that. It's in their packaging, you might say. That's the reputation of a letter. The other thing that I found in researching, I did a comparison between Seneca's moral epistles and the Apostle Paul's letter. And we know, which was extremely handy actually, because we know that the moral epistles are all fictive. So there I'm in safe territory with fictive letters, and I have an epistolographer, a letter writer, who is manipulating the letter, and I can look at how he's manipulating the letter in a safe place, because I know they're fictive. I know his addressee, Lucilius, is fictive, so I can look at all of that. And then I can take that and see, are there parallels, or can I make parallels with the Pauline letters? So that's one of the things that I do. And what I discover is, this is something else that, a nice discovery for me, is that these epistographers were smart about this. Seneca knew he's writing fictive letters, but he had to keep up the fiction of a letter. And you can see how he's keeping up the fiction of a letter. First of all, each letter starts with Seneca to my Lucilius greetings. So each time he's making it a new letter, he's making a new relationship with Lucilius, which is very attractive for secondary readers. And all these fictive letters are aimed at secondary readers. The regular addressor, the dramatic addressor doesn't exist, right? So Seneca's writing to the person over there, the secondary reader, but he wants it to look like a letter. So he keeps talking to Lucilius. So I talk about sender-addressee engagement. Epistolographers have to keep that up so that it keeps looking like a letter. And that's one of the things they do. So Seneca says, "Oh, I imagined seeing you yesterday, Lucilius. It was wonderful to think about you." And that keeps up this engagement, this letter-like engagement, meaning that people are going to read his letters. What are his letters? His letters are Stoic teachings. Seneca ultimately wants to teach Stoic philosophy, but he does it through this friendly medium of a letter, which is very interesting. The other nice thing about a letter is, again, epistolographers have to keep the letter engagement going, and one of the other moves that they make is to put in what's called occasional discourse or concrete issues. They bring it back down to earth and say, "Oh, did you send me a letter yesterday? Seems like I heard from you." And that keeps up this fiction of a letter, that you have a real letter. Then that'll go on for one or two sentences, and they'll say, you have to keep up your Stoic discipline. You have to really be concentrated on this. But they pepper it with these occasional remarks. And you can see the same things happening in the Pauline discourse. References to letters, that happens quite often. Little drops of mentioning another letter here or there. That can be seen as a discrete episode. Or I think these other things about the man who's sleeping with his stepmother. You get issues that segue into teachings, and that lends itself very beautifully in a letter format. It's interest. It's all about reader interest. It's what you're working at, and a letter allows that.
Who is Clement of Rome? What do you make of First Clement? And did Clement compose the letter? And does it indicate Paul existed and attest his letters in the first century in any way?
Well, that I do bring up First Clement. It's one of the letters I talk about, and Clement becomes important for my thesis. He could be, you might say, a spoiler in my theory that the letters are a collection of closer toward the mid-2nd century. And a spoiler because the letter First Clement does refer to Pauline letters, and that the traditional dating of the letter First Clement has been the end of the 1st century, around 96. So that's where it would be a spoiler, you might say. But in more, which is what I talk about in the book, is more recent scholarship dismisses that 96, the date of First Clement is 96, and much more easily can see it as a mid-2nd century letter. So it does not overturn then a mid-2nd century collection of Pauline letters. the fact that First Clement knows it can still be after the collection of the Pauline letters, once First Clement is moved later. But First Clement, I was looking at it again recently. It's very long. I don't know if you know First Clement. It goes on and on and on.
I'm aware.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of First or Second Peter, but greatly stretched out much more. Where I'm going with this, it looks like, really an expanded First Peter. So already, with my leaning toward fictive apostolic letters, I would say that is just another manifestation influenced by the Pauline letters and First Peter, and then taking the letter even to a further manifestation of a very long letter with teachings and encouragements on moral behavior. How it became associated with Clement of Rome, I'm not exactly sure, and called First Clement, because it doesn't really talk about itself as being First Clement. The addressee and addressor it comes from a community of Rome to a community of Corinth, which is interesting. How can you probably wouldn't have a whole community writing the letter. Clearly one person, I guess Clement was thought to be the author behind that community of Rome in the traditional way of looking at it. To be the scribe talking up for that, giving the advice for that community of Rome, Clement of Rome, yeah.
Did Paul exist?
Well, I sort of got to that a little bit. I think Paul exists in Acts. Well, there's really two Pauls, aren't there? And there's been two Pauls since I've been studying this material. And it's even more pronounced in a lot of the scholarship. There's the Paul of Acts and the Apostle Paul of the letters, and there's certainly relationships. And there's always been relationships, but we've thought the reverse, haven't we? That the letters preceded Acts. The letters, several scholars think that the letters inform Acts. And I would have said before I wrote this book that the Paul of the letters existed and wrote those letters, but I don't hold to that anymore. I think the letters were written by another person. So the Paul of Acts, I think, was a fictive Paul and has been a fictive Paul in scholarship for a long time. It was just the Paul of the letters who was writing letters as he's moving around to various communities. I think a stationary writer in a school, a known school, makes more sense of the letters and even the topics of the letters. As I said at the beginning, this question of the history of Paul, or the historical Paul, is a modern question. It wasn't there at the beginning. I think it's a question that emerges around the Enlightenment, and we're still thinking about that historical question. But look at all the importance of Paul without the importance of the historical Paul. I don't see a loss. I wonder, when you ask me this, are people going to think this is a loss for the religion, a loss for faith, or whatever? I don't see it as a loss. I see it as a gain, especially a gain for how we understand early Christianity. If this helps us to get a clearer picture of the emergence of Christianity. I mean, that's what I'm hoping for with this, that we can rethink how did it emerge? How did Christianity emerge? And I think the place of literature is important for this emergence of Christianity.
This video is a debate in which Bruce and Nina will be debating, did Paul the Apostle actually exist, and did he compose the 7 authentic letters of Paul? Now, primarily, it's going to be centered on, did Paul write the 7 letters or not? But that will also entail, in part, did Paul exist or not as a historical figure? That will come up from time to time during the debate. And I'll have the links to purchase Nina Livesey's book, The Letters of Paul in the Roman Literary Context, and Bruce Schulten's book, Rabbi Paul, an Intellectual Biography. Both will be linked in the description below and the pinned comment. And with that being said, Nina and Bruce, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
thanks for setting this up.
Yeah, of course, and thank you both for allowing me to moderate this debate. So I want to start off with the introductory argument. We're going to go for 10 minutes. And Nina, you'll go first. I'll start the timer now.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob. So, after careful review of the scholarship on the modern history of the question of authenticity, modern Pauline epistolary scholarship, Pauline collection theories, and Pauline chronologies and historical studies, I was both surprised and struck by the abundance of flawed methodologies, especially in the form of circular reasoning, a high degree of confidence regarding the historical reliability of letter content, idealism, and all of this coupled with a very high regard for the Apostle Paul. At the same time, I was equally struck by an overall lack of external evidence for the 7 letters dated to the mid-first century for Paul or Paulos and for the community addressees. Thus, I concluded from this initial research that the authentic perspective, which Jacob is talking about in the background here, is inadequately or even hardly substantiated, not well substantiated. My investigation led me at first, and at the very least, to consider that the letters are something other than genuine correspondence from the Apostle Paul. Perhaps an example from one of my areas of inquiry will serve to illustrate the type of scholarship I encountered and my estimation of the kind of reasoning I found. Collection theories were one avenue of investigation, as I mentioned. As you know, these theories attempt to account for a collection of Pauline letters. This is because our early and indeed our only extant evidence of Pauline letters is in the form of a collection. Manuscript evidence of the letters is only that of collected letters, and so too is Marcion's Apostolikon, thought by some to be the earliest evidence of Pauline letters. So, and again, as you surely know, Bruce, the question the theories attempt to answer is how the letters, believed to have been sent far and wide and delivered to disparate ancient cities and regions, came together as a collection. All the theories rely on the situation of the Apostle Paul and the community recipients as found in the letters. That is, they trust in the historical reliability of the letter parties and the basic contours of the letter contents. Some of their baseline assumptions are as follows. The communities designated without detailed specificity by region or city name alone existed. The Christian faith was adopted early and spread to those ancient cities and regions designated by the letters. This happened even before the receipt of a letter from the Apostle Paul. The letters themselves are suggestive of this, as the apostle is seen to refine teachings and encourage progress in them. That is, the apostle addresses those who are depicted as already in the faith. Thirdly, the apostle Paul was recognized as being a significant spokesperson for the faithful, honored among them, so much so that in the earliest theories, his letters were prized and retained. Moreover, in those earliest theories, all the communities acted in lockstep, all carefully preserved their Pauline letter. So, given this situation, how are the letters then gathered into a group? How are they made into a collection? So, in the early collection theories, Christian adherents who were aware of the communities in the various ancient cities traveled to them, to those sites, knowing just where they were. They attained a copy of their Pauline letter and eventually accumulated them into a group. I'm somewhat simplifying, but not too much. Subsequent theories adopt the view that the Apostle Paul himself kept copies of his letters, and his disciples at a later period gathered them into a collection. Methodologically, however, these theories evince various problems. Significantly, they rely nearly exclusively on information internal to the letters themselves, while supplying no external verification. This pertains to the Apostle Paul, the communities, and the letters themselves. Without sufficient evidence, they assume burgeoning Christian communities or cells in the decades just after the death of Jesus. Yet this is an understanding that finds residence, I would argue, in the book of Acts, which is an idealized narrative of Christian origins. The earliest theories are likewise logistically problematic, for without specificity, how would the Christian cells have been located? Not considered is that addressees defined as recognizable ancient cities or regions is suggestive, or could likely be suggestive, of the wide spread of the message into prominent places, echoing the symbolic use of cities as found in the embedded letters of Revelation, for example, where those cities taken together, those 7 cities of Revelation, to mean universality. They're not instances of historical data. Moreover, that the Apostle Paul's letters would have been recognized as significant depends on prior knowledge and even a high regard for Paul. Yet how would those communities have known the Apostle Paul? A high esteem for the Apostle Paul resonates, however, with modern understandings of him, based on the letters' presence in the canon, for example. That the Apostle Paul would have kept copies of his letters and his disciples attended to their gathering into a collection eases the situation of a collection, yet also requires some kind of institutional setting, like a school of Paul. Yet there's no evidence for the latter. That theory, too, appears to be based on later notions of the importance of those letters and the significance of the Apostle Paul. Recent scholarship has shown that there's no term for Christianity prior to the 2nd century, We see that in Acts and First Peter, for instance, undermining the notion of groups formed around Christian concepts. Moreover, the mid-first century is a time assessed to be prior to the written Gospels, and it's there that we find articulations of the Christian faith. Thus, the authentic perspective is too early. It's depicted as being too early, as that perspective posits a time prior to
1 minute.
written Gospels. So it's hard to reconcile these scenarios as found in the collection theories. The more I sit with the thesis, and I'm going to the end here, I find that it has better explanatory value than the authentic perspective. I find the letters are fictional, and fictional or literary letters allow for greater conceptual compatibility between all the various canonical textual types: Gospels, Acts, Apocalypse, and then add letters. Fictive letters readily accommodate recharacterization of figures, especially the inscribed sender. Events within letters need not be overly pressed for historical veracity.
Time.
Thank you. Sorry if it went on a little longer.
Oh no, it's fine. It was about 10 minutes, practically on the dot. All right, Bruce. I'll start the timer.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob. And thank you, Nina, very much for that very effective resume of the part of your argument that has to do with the way in which such a collection might have developed, an issue which I hope will indeed unfold itself further as the discussion continues. Another aspect of your book that I found extremely valuable and that I've wanted to call attention to for some time is the placement of the Pauline corpus, along with other elements of the New Testament, within the general framework of ancient literature, especially Greco-Roman, but also broader than that. And that literature involves us in the whole question of pseudonymity, that documents which we can say at the moment appear quite clearly not to have been composed by the putative author were either accepted as such in antiquity or in antiquity came to have the authority of that particular writer. You draw our attention to similarities between the Pauline corpus on the one hand and the corpus of Plato and Seneca on the other hand. And this strikes me as a very important comparison in terms of certain formal elements of the letters. Also, because I think it does demonstrate, and I believe this should be accepted, it does demonstrate that the letter in antiquity could be a form of discourse, really quite unlike what we think of as being a letter. I was recently working on a project in which both Josephus and Philo refer to the interactions between King Agrippa I and Caligula. And one of them characterizes this as a personal conversation and the other as a letter. And sure enough, the form of the discourse is remarkably similar. I think that conceptually speaking, we are dealing with a world in which the letter can have that kind of valence. So for me, this is one of the most interesting parts of your discussion. And the other is that, of course, Plato and Seneca are themselves troublesome figures from the point of view of pseudonymity. As it happens, we have finally had erupt at our classics department at Bard College a long simmering battle between those who want to accept the later sources of Seneca and those who do not. and those who want to accept the later sources of Plato and do not. I'm really quite struck by the elasticity of the argument involved as compared to what scholars of the New Testament might do. It seems to me in this regard, actually, we are a little bit more rigorous. And the feature that I think we need to bear in mind is that this pseudonymous tendency is by no means limited to the New Testament. It is often treated as if that's the case, owing to a background discussion of fundamentalism, often treated as if the New Testament is somehow special in having the question of pseudonymity come up. It isn't. It's a part of ancient literature, and not only Greco-Roman. I mean, let's think of what's being produced at the same time in Judaism in a way that can be compared to the New Testament. Let's think of the fourth book of Ezra, second book of Baruch, the so-called pseudo-Philo, the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, all of which provide readings that can be compared to the Pauline corpus and to other parts of the New Testament, and are quite, if I may say, transparently pseudonymous. I don't think anyone believes Ezra wrote for Ezra, and so forth. I've just, as Jacob knows, completed a project in which we have cataloged the ways in which ancient Jewish literature in Aramaic, the Targumim, and rabbinic literature deal with scriptural texts from the canon of Israel and the way in which that can be compared to the New Testament. All of those resources are effectively pseudonymous in that they are held to be transmitted along chains of authority, which we can show, in fact, were not a part of the composition history. And then the scripture. Here we often, and I have to say, as if it is a matter of course, refer to the way in which scriptures of Israel have an impact on the New Testament, but those scriptures are themselves pseudonymous. Book of Isaiah can only be plausibly attributed to the 8th century prophet up until chapter 39, if you include middle 20s chapters, if you exclude middle 20s chapters. Thereafter, you have to think in terms of the second Isaiah, with its reference to Cyrus as being the anointed, the Messiah, and designated as such by God himself. So it's clear we're not talking about an 8th century setting whatsoever. And then later, from chapter 55, we have to think in terms of yet another setting, namely the return of exiles from Babylonia to Judea, which applies a time really quite later than Cyrus. And Ezekiel is not unlike this, and Zechariah is not unlike this. Ancient literature floats on a sea of pseudonymity. And that's the way in which it actually come in to be culturally influential. So the question is, and this is one reason I think why our classicists are right now at one another's throats, apart from the fact that that's what classicists do, it is that the question emerges, when you know that something is pseudonymous, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you who didn't write it, in one sense, but it also tells you that this particular document has used attribution in order to make a certain point. What is that point? What is that document actually about? What is pseudo about it is not so much the epigraphy as the name, the attribution. And I think that one aspect that we tend to lose sight of is that there's a tendency among scholars to imagine that if we settled questions of authorship, then that settles everything. It doesn't really, because that is only of use in helping us to understand the way in which this particular text has come into existence. And I'll give some examples. I'm not sure of my timing here, Jacob, but so don't hesitate to close me down when you have to.
You have close to 2 minutes.
Oh, that's great. So I'll come to examples, I think, later. But I first of all would like to point out that on the whole, the field hasn't done bad placing Paul within a context of pseudonymity. Yes, there's widespread agreement, and there is widespread agreement, that First Thessalonians, Galatians, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon ought to be treated as Pauline. Adela Collins recently does this in her book, Paul Transformed Forever. But what does that imply? Well, it implies that Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews are pseudonymous. Oh, and by the way, it doesn't stop there, because we also have extra-canonically 3 Corinthians, named epistles to Laodiceans and Alexandrians, Acts of Paul, Paul of Thecla, a correspondence, imagine it, between Seneca and Paul, the Latin Apocalypse of Paul, and the Coptic Apocalypse of Paul. Now, they can't possibly all be authentic, and that represents a major advance in thinking, that we don't think of them all as being authentic. But what I would like to point out is, proportionally speaking, it is not as if the current consensus was developed out of an inattention to the whole issue of pseudonymity. Did I do okay on time?
Yeah, you have 8 seconds left.
Well, I'll yield my 8 seconds.
All right, Nina, for your for the first round of responses, you can begin your 10 minutes.
Thank you. I may not go 10 minutes. We'll see. I must say I loved a lot of what you said, Bruce. I wished I'd had you by my side. Some of the things you articulated were beautiful about pseudonymity. So thank you. I'll get a recording of this and keep track of that in that way now. So, yes, what I'd like to say, and following on what you've said about pseudonymity, we need to embrace pseudonymity. It does make a point about if you say that a letter of Paul is pseudonymous, then you have to ask the question, and I'm just going by what I've found you've said, why call it Paul? Then you need to ask that question, which moves scholarship along. By simply saying it's Paul, you basically have stopped any kind of further evaluation or scholarship. Well, it's settled. We know Paul wrote it. Okay, well, where do we go from here? And as you have said, Bruce, everything else we have from Paul is likely pseudonymous. So how does that fit? If we know some things are a Paul, okay, can't do anything more with those, but the rest of what we have from Paul is pseudonymous, and we can talk creatively about those other things. So yeah, I wanted to say the question of historicity basically stops the conversation. I do think there's a hang up, and I loved a lot of what you said about pseudonymity. But to me, the problem that I see within the field has to do with the genre. So when you talked about Ezra, these are books, right? They're not letters. So there's a hang up, I think, because it's a letter. So this is what I think is behind a lot of the authenticity issue with the letter and the resistance. It's because a letter, more so than a book that's already in the Hebrew Bible or other kinds of books that we might have, a letter seems more realistic, more honest. I have said in my book that that is a rhetorical move to use a letter because it seems real. You can do a lot with it now. You can uh, be creative because it seems like you have something real. And that becomes more powerful, especially when it's attributed to a figure like Paul, who's made into an apostle. So, this rhetorical use of a letter, and I kind of wove around a little bit in my response, but got a few points out, perhaps. Enough for you to respond, perhaps.
All right,
I'm
Bruce.
ceding the rest of my time.
All right. See, we're both creative in our use of time. That's great. I'd like, if I may, to pick up your comment about talking creatively about other things when we're dealing with the parts of the literature, whichever parts we think are pseudonymous, as being pseudonymous. And I just want to emphasize how important that is in dealing with this particular corpus, because key passages of what is agreed to be pseudonymously Pauline have exerted an enormous impact on the development of early Christian thinking. So that I think, and I'll refer to this, I think, probably later on in a different context, I'm thinking of the presentation of Christ dying in Hebrews chapter 9 as being his entry into the heavenly holy places, such that there's understood to be a Platonic correspondence between the shadow of those realities, which is held to be the temple in Jerusalem, and the permanent holy place, which is held to be celestial. Now, that kind of typology can be related to other Pauline letters, there's no question about it. On the other hand, the fully transparent cosmological Platonism of Hebrews marks an especially important moment in the development of early Christian thinking, especially because then that entry of Christ, as it is portrayed, into the heavenly sanctuary is what is held to have produced the possibility of forgiveness. Now, this conception stays with Christianity not only in its theology, but also in its presentation of Christ's sacrifice in the Eucharist. It will be heavily developed by Cyprian of Carthage, but then just be a part of the furniture of early Christian thinking until the time when, in the Middle Ages, Aristotle will come and take the relief of Plato. Even then, I have to say, I don't believe for a moment that we can speak of the eclipse of Platonic thinking in Christianity. But this shift is more thoroughly accomplished in Hebrews than it is in any other New Testament writing. And so, in that context, I believe I can understand why it attempts to pass as a Pauline statement. That is, it wants to take what the author knows of the position of Paul in regard to forgiveness and make it into this conception of a Platonic sacrifice. But if you don't factor that into the development of early Christian thought, I don't think it's possible really to understand what happens second century and subsequent to that. Similarly, Ephesians is the one letter that asserts a kind of claim about Christian unity within one Lord, one faith, one baptism, which it is held actually transcends the distinction between Jew and Greek, so that the wall of partition, it is claimed, is shattered that separated them. Well, I think anyone reading other Pauline letters would not think of that partition as being demolished by what is going on. Something new, something fresh, interesting is going on in Ephesians, and it is also producing a claim for the unity within the faith, which in turn makes the faith much less tolerant of those who are not a part of it. So I'm not claiming for a moment that these are progressive changes or that these are correct changes, but they are moments in the history of pseudonymity where one can see them making a contribution. Uh, it helps us to see that there is an important distinction, and I think your history of discussion helps one to perceive this. There's a distinction between what you have to say about authorship and whether something is a part of the canon, and in turn, whether it exerts an influence. It might not be in the canon at all, and yet exert an influence. On the other hand, one might think it's quite obvious, as I think it is with Hebrews and Ephesians, that these are post Pauline writings. Of course, it is true that there's always room for argument. So, for example, there was a review of Adela Collins's book, Paul Transformed, where the reviewer, Stefan Krauter, made the observation, gee, the picture would be different if we saw Colossians and Second Thessalonians as being authentic. Well, he's right, but he never explains why we should, and I'm sure he will in due course. He's writing a commentary just now on the pastorals. But it is different, and I was, I have to say, pleased by that, because I also allow for some elements of Paul within Colossians. But on Second Thessalonians, I don't see that at all. And I'll give an example later on why I don't see that as being the same. On the issue of the letter as being chosen because it's more realistic, I think that is generally the case. And the example that I gave from the writings of Josephus and Philo, I think tends towards the same direction. It's very interesting that the book of Acts has James, the brother of Jesus, sending a letter. Who would have thought of that? Why should you include the letter and quote it in the way that you do? I think Acts sees this as adding a element of verisimilitude to what is being said. Incidentally, in that regard, when this letter is sent in Acts chapter 15, it is accompanied by emissaries who are sent out from James, one of whom is Silas, also known as Silvanus, who can be associated with Paul. And in the course of that, when they refer to them strengthening the community in association with this letter, prophesying alongside it, they use the verb episterizo. I've just begun a project on the book of Acts. I'm just interested by the choice of the word episterizo with a preposition instead of simply sterizo, which is already there in Luke. And I wonder if it refers in particular to the way in which you understand there to be a interface between oral communication and the letter form, which is to suggest that it's also possible to think creatively about materials that are authentic. There's no reason in the world why the finding of authenticity should shut down historical analysis. I agree that does happen, but I think that does happen because of the confusion between something being historic and something being canonical, but a confusion this time which occurs in a different way. Certainly, these are all, I think, examples of living communication, even when, and in fact, especially when, they are stylized communications. I think most of us know when you get a letter that is expressed with a strong point of view. It is not necessarily a direct apprehension of reality. And you have to ask, well, why is this being written at all? Why is it present?
1 minute.
And that's one of the ways in which it's possible to falsify a document in terms of attribution, but then that falsification itself becomes a part of the impact that it exerts over time. Do I have another 8 seconds?
He wants to make them
You had
up.
like 80. I think you had like 40 seconds actually.
Oh, I
40
did. Okay,
seconds.
well, that's fine. No, that's good. That's good.
Okay. All right. For the second round of responses, Nina, you can begin.
Uh, well, I appreciate what you said about the worth of Hebrews for theology, and also and the importance it has had on the Christian tradition, and also for Ephesians, those two letters which um, are generally thought of as pseudonymous if you still hold to the seven authentic letters thesis, right? Um, it seems to me too that you're following a little bit of a generational way of looking at things. In other words, the seven authentic letters are an original group where you have Paul's early teachings, earlier thoughts, and then progressively other the letters are added on, and you have notions of institutionalization, more theory that doesn't necessarily line up with the centrality of something like justification by faith, that is thought to hold those authentic letters together. Um, I haven't investigated thoroughly um, how that generational theory could be disturbed, but I have a sense in which it could be disturbed to such an extent that you could imagine or um, credibly ascertain and put forward an argument that a group of letters, like those 10 letters that Marcion compiled, all came together. They were all done around the same time, maybe within a year or two of each other. And then when Marcion, well, in my theory, I'm thinking it was probably somebody like Marcion, because with him we have those 10 letters. He got all of his group together and he said, okay, we got enough now. And we have also represented seven different communities, which is also handy. I think that that is playing a role too somehow. Let's publish those together. So I don't necessarily think that you have to have a generational theory, something later, something more rarefied, like Hebrews, Platonic thought, and all of these things that gradually grows on an earlier thought. Um, as I said, I haven't investigated that thoroughly, but I think it could be put forward for more analysis in the future. Um, you want to stay with the authentic letters, and I get that. I mean, it's what I'm putting forward is different. It's a paradigm that's not often spoken about. Um, it's different. I will tell you, I have been sitting with this since 2018. For me, I'm much more comfortable with it. And as I said at the end of my first 10 minutes, I had another paragraph in there, but I jumped over it. I do feel comfortable with my thesis. Um, and some of it, as you know from reading the book, is how do we have an Apostle Paul to write letters in the first place? That I think is a problem in the authentic perspective. Um, Paul seems to come out of nowhere. Okay, how is that, and how can those letters then be recognized? Which is what I alluded to a little bit in the collection theories. The community's got the letter, and they already said, "Hey, we've got a letter from the Apostle Paul." Well, how is that if we don't have a concept of the Apostle Paul? And in my view, that comes from literature. It's the literature that gives us the Apostle Paul. And then the letters are enabled, because that's what good letters do, especially pseudonymous letters, coming back to what you have focused on originally, Bruce. Pseudonymous letters, they're pros at that. Pros at taking a character and re-articulating that character. I'll say he, because almost all of these pseudonymous letters are by males. I haven't encountered a female collection. So that fits. It fits nicely. It fits squarely with a problematic that is not acknowledged of how you come to get the Apostle Paul. I'll stop there.
All right, Bruce, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. As we look into this question of whether there is development among the letters, which I think I would prefer as language rather than generational. Whenever I speak
Okay,
of
good.
generational, it makes me feel old. So I'd rather speak of development instead. And I think, as you rightly say, it has long been recognized that it appears that references to people who have authority in churches and use of the term ecclesia begins to modulate over time. And that this is a much more prominent concern, especially in the famous pastoral epistles, which, by the way, seem to me much better to fit the Senecan fictive letter, in the sense of a letter to a person being exactly when it's really not a letter to a person. It's rather intending to make a far more general statement. So I would take that as a case where an agreed upon pseudonymous letter is in that position. But I'd like to concentrate on something which I personally find more interesting, because it comes into my orientation in reading these letters. In other words, how it is that what appear to be later letters attempt to resolve issues that are problematic, that emerge from what appear to be earlier letters. I'll just give a couple examples of this. There are many more that might be investigated. The statement that's made in 1 Timothy 1:8, we know that the law is good if one makes use of it lawfully. Wouldn't life have been easier in the audiences of Romans and Galatians and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians if this were available as a synopsis of Paul's own position? But as we know, his own relationship to the Torah, understood as law, is far more twisted and complicated than that. I just give the one example of Romans 3:28 as a kind of classic statement. We consider a person to be made just by faith apart from deeds of the law, very famously, after he's just said that, in fact, the law has predictive force in understanding this faith. First Timothy manages entirely to bracket out that kind of consideration. Similarly, I already referred to the usage of temple imagery in Hebrews chapter 9, to the point that at that point in verse 24, the author can say Christ did not enter into holy places that are copies of the true, but into heaven itself. Well, this stands in some contrast to what the writer, whoever that writer might be, of Romans 15:16 says, when he refers to himself. Yeah, it really is masculine anyway in the Greek, so we can't get away from it. I agree with you. Refer to himself as in the officiant of Jesus Christ for the Gentiles, doing the priestly work of the message, so that the offering of the Gentiles might be acceptable, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. And then he says, and I'm going now to Jerusalem, where there's a temple functioning, apparently within the worldview of that letter. And then to give an example from 2 Thessalonians, and this is why I don't agree with the idea of Stefan Krauter that 2 Thessalonians should be put within this group of, let me just call them prior letters for the moment. You have this statement in 2 Thessalonians 2:2, do not be easily shaken in mind or alarmed by spirit or word or letter, as if from us that the day of the Lord has arrived. And so Second Thessalonians commits itself to the elongated understanding of apocalypse, which of course, will eventually be perfected in the work called the apocalypse. Now, why would you ever think that someone could read Paul and think that the day of the Lord has already arrived? Why? Because he said exactly that kind of thing in 1 Corinthians, when he speaks of the schema, the form of this world as already passing away. Now, I'll fully agree with you, completely agree with you, that this kind of development doesn't show who the author is of the previous statements, which are being amended at the later stage. There might be a development of a completely fictive author. But is that likely? The other examples of pseudonymity that we've referred to in other forms of ancient literatures, on the whole, develop out of some corpus that existed. At times, where I have to agree is, at times, the linkage might be very slight. For example, I don't believe for a moment that there's much Enoch in the Enochic tradition. And yet it grew very spectacularly from the 3rd century before the Common Era until the 2nd century of the Common Era. And by the way, it includes a letter. So yes, there are examples in which one might develop that kind of understanding. But in any case, you're dealing with a developmental trajectory, which I think exegetically we want to make sure that we can do justice to. Because at the end of the day, the winning argument, as you know, in any analysis that involves exegesis is what better explains the text. And that's the position I find myself in.
Okay. You waited the waste of your time?
Indeed, yes.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
So now we're going to enter the dialogue phase. So you can both ask each other questions, perhaps maybe ask what would convince the other of their view. We start now.
So what would it take to convince you? I could ask that question.
You know, I was quite taken by your earlier question, basically, where did Paul come from? And, the book of Acts would like to answer that question. Paul came from friendship with Barnabas, that Barnabas is the prior apostle, which in effect answers a mystery with a mystery, namely, well, where does Barnabas come within this whole trajectory? Does seem to be the case that the term apostolos is used rather more loosely in Acts, but also, for that matter, also in the Pauline corpus, than we might expect if there was any kind of fixity about that understanding. So I agree with you with the point that you made more in the book than in our discussion, that the picture, as in Deisman, of Paul as this great charismatic figure is a bit much. I mean, one thing I would say that comes out of these letters referred to as authentic is that this is not a charismatic personality that actually produces this work. One can easily understand when he refers to opposition why there was opposition to him. On the other hand, there is also a mastery of Judaic tradition, which is deployed in order to make his overall, at the end of the day, prophetic case as to what it is that his particular evangelion stands for. So I am not too troubled by the inability of New Testament sources to give us Paul's background, apart from the snippets that they do, nor does it actually bother me. Let's say, why doesn't Josephus mention him? Well, why exactly should Josephus mention him? Why doesn't he come up in Roman historians? Well, he's too insignificant. There are many cases within this literature and within Judaic literature where the references have to be built up on the basis of internal indications. And again, in that instance, one operates on the basis of inference as to whether the best possible explanation has been achieved. So I have a question. Would it really hurt?
Okay.
Would it really hurt you if he wrote anything that we have? I mean, let's say we went
Um,
back to F.C. Bauer. Let's say it's only those four. Would you be happier with that?
that's a good question. Um, I I think that it still creates the problems to have letters that are written by the Apostle Paul. For me, it would still create problems.
Mm-hmm.
Problems because of how I'm now looking at the letters, um, that don't, which is something we haven't talked about here, they don't even look so much like real letters, especially the
Mm-hmm.
canonical
Mm-hmm.
letters, the form of those letters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another whole issue there. And also the rhetorical sense of the letters seems to be more powerful to me now than the historical
Mm-hmm.
letter actually going out and being somehow genuine correspondence. I don't see how that will line up well. And that goes back to what I said earlier with regard to collection theories.
Mm-hmm.
Too many things for me, based on my research, just don't line up
Mm-hmm.
well. And in terms of Paul and how we know of Paul, um, I think um, we know of Paul, who was formerly Saul, and there was something very important to change that to become a Roman character, a Paulus,
Mm-hmm.
who has a Roman name.
Mm-hmm.
So we would lose some of that interesting signification, um, spiraling back to the authentic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I would
Right.
answer that. I
Mm-hmm.
would probably, as I told Jacob prior to the debate, I will probably tomorrow at this time think of a much better response to your
Oh,
question than I
what
can think of right now off the top of my head. That's
this
how it
always
is with me. It's tough.
no, it's fair enough that that goes on. I have to say I agree about your rhetorical comment. That is, I also think that authentic letters are often rhetorical,
Yes.
and that Paul's are, and a lot depends on what kind of rhetorical situation one is addressing. So I mentioned Adela Collins's book. There, she makes that a case that Markian, in particular, is appropriating what Paul says about sexuality and applying it in a different way. In other words, she there, within her reception history, is speaking of this in terms of development. And I think
Mhm.
myself, this is perhaps one area in which I disagree with the finding of your book. Uh, I think that the argument about circumcision does not have to await the Bar Kokhba War to emerge, because we have very good evidence of what I would call Roman Judeophobia over the particular issue of circumcision, and that problem emerging prior to the breakout of the Bar Kokhba revolt, especially, for example, in the satires of Juvenal.
Mhm.
And we can also see it in the practices of the family of Herod the Great. Uh, the women of Herod the Great's family were usually insistent that anyone they married should be circumcised, so that if someone was not circumcised, he had to go through that procedure prior. So King Polemon of Cilicia has himself circumcised so that he can marry Berenice, Herod the Great's great granddaughter. All fine. But something very interesting also happens. Her sister, Drusilla, marries Felix, the procurator, and he doesn't circumcise. And Berenice herself, after leaving Polemon, because that didn't work out, has a long standing affair with Titus, the general and future emperor, who, of course, also does not go through circumcision. So the understanding of a kind of Roman horror at circumcision is something which I think does not have to, it doesn't await the Bar Kokhba revolt. Without question at all, thinkers such as Justin Martyr now take this to be evidence that it's over, that all
Mhm.
Judaism has now come to an end. I mean, that revolt was without doubt, and I think this is an important feature of your book, was without doubt a deeper influence on Christian ideology than was the destruction of the temple in 70. But I don't have a problem seeing a Galatians taking up a attitude towards circumcision, very much like that, which I can see also among Roman writers of the period.
Of an earlier period,
Yeah,
you're
of an early,
saying.
yeah, that's right.
Hmm.
In other words, it does work prior to the second century.
Yeah. Um,
That there's a rhetorical situation then towards which I think the rhetoric is targeted.
yeah. And I've seen those issues, and I see also a certain discomfort with circumcision in some of those sources that you've mentioned and the discussion of circumcision. But this um, do not become circumcised, which I find in Galatians is quite strong. How does it become so strong? I would argue is an apologetic. Um, there's an apology going on there. And then you have to ask, why is there an apology happening? And
Hmm.
that I think is Roman rule that is behind an apologetic attitude toward circumcision. Um, so I don't know. I think we differ there
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
terms of
Hmm.
the degree. In degree, attitudes
Exactly. I think
towards circumcision. There's a problematic there.
yeah, I think it's a question of degree, and also a degree of difference over who you're telling not to circumcise.
Hmm.
That is, are you saying, look, if you're a Gentile, do not circumcise, which, according to the book of Acts, is not the unique position of Paul? Or are you saying, in fact, circumcision is all over, along with the destruction of the temple? Now, that, I think, is a key difference. And as far as I can see, it's a difference that emerges during the course of the second century. Totally agree with that. And I do think that the Bar Kokhba War is central to that development.
And so I put the letters there.
I know that, and that's exactly why I don't. In the case of Galatians and Romans, sort of taking the lead on that issue. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's a difference in how we're reading it,
Exactly.
which
That's right.
it's to be understood amongst two scholars.
It's
How
been
we're
known.
reading.
It's been known to happen. Exactly.
Exactly.
Why do you think the Pauline epistles were created? What was the purpose of them?
The dramatic setting of the letters, however, assumes a different social situation, the life of the communities of faith. There's a conflict in the letters, just like there's conflict in Acts, but that comes from within the communities. That type of conflict implies, I think, a certain degree of conceptually, a stabilization around the message.
What's more plausible? That an Acts narrator sees a literally 5 words in a sentence, or small sentence, and decides, I think I'm just going to write this long story based off this one little sentence, and I am going to anchor it in this earlier mythic motif.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on the History Bible Podcast, and today I'm joined by Dr. Nina Livesey and also Derek Lambert from Mid-Vision Podcast. And again, let's remind everybody that the link to purchase Nina's book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship, will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Nina and Derek, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you,
Thank
Jacob.
you. Thanks for the invitation, Jacob.
And so we're going to be continuing the discussion about the later dating of Paul's letters. And to that end, I want to get started with my first question. What was the first of the clues that led you to conclude the epistles of Paul are 2nd century CE texts?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, there was a backstory. So it wasn't until after I determined that there was nothing really holding the letters to the mid-1st century, and there was a lot of research behind that, and that the letters were likely fictive based on my research, that I began to think about their dating. So I didn't immediately run to the 2nd century, in other words. So as you likely recall, it was my work on the analysis of the letters from a rhetorical perspective that led me to question their authenticity and to the determination that the letters were likely fictive. So bolstering my understanding that the letters are fictive was my observation of a wealth of fictive letters in antiquity. And this is something I learned also as part of the research. And even closer to home, when you think about it, there are many letters in the Hebrew Bible, embedded letters within other texts that are considered fictive. So fictive letters doesn't come out of nowhere, is what I'm trying to say. The 2nd century dating is a result of my first and primary evaluation that the letters are fictive. The 2nd century comes into view when looking for evidence of the letters. And there is where I find that Marcion's collection emerged also in that scholarship for having published the Apostolicon and his is the first relatively secure evidence of the letters. And he's a mid-second century figure. So in earlier scholarship, and I'm thinking here of the Dutch radicals as one example, Marcion also does emerge as a suggested locative location, you might say, as the originating place for the letters, Pauline letters. So another way of saying this, I did come to Marcion, but others have also come to Marcion as well, namely these Dutch radical thinkers. So I hope that answers your question.
Who is Marcion, and what did he say about the Pauline epistles?
So Marcion, and thank you for your question, Marcion was active in this mid-second century, and his dates, he's actually late first century, born around 85, we think, and died around 160. Those are estimated dates. It's thought that he came from Pontus, which is modern-day Turkey, in the city of Sinope, and that he actually came to Rome just after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which dates to 132, 135. So we could say that he showed up in Rome right around 135 or slightly later. He's among the elite class, which plays a role in all of this. He's wealthy, and with his wealth, thought to derive from shipbuilding. So he's from a shipbuilding family, you might say. His social status and his wealth is suggestive, and this is where I think it's important, of someone well positioned to have been afforded the opportunity of a full education, something that required not just money, but time, leisure. It took all of the youth, like it does here, all of your youth till you're 18, let's say, graduating from high school, is devoted to education. But that wasn't the way in the ancient world. Only the wealthy were afforded that type of leisure, and you needed money as well. He also had social connections. So even to have that education meant that he had certain high place social connections. So really, scholars have thought of Marcion as a writer intellectual. Other ancient authors refer to him as a philosopher and a teacher, someone who had a school in Rome. The least problematic, perhaps, of Marcion is that he is thought to have written a work on his own called the Antitheses. That's lost. We don't have it at all. But it was comprised, just as the word antithesis implies, these oppositional statements. And as we have it, in fact, a lot of what we have about Marcion from his opponents actually is that he did have these antitheses, namely between the Jewish law or Torah and the gospel. And he also had a two-God philosophy where there's a creator God, kind of dividing up God, you might say, creator God of Hebrew scriptures, and then a superior God of Jesus Christ, a different God. He's also credited with the term New Testament, and there you have another type of opposition to Old Testament. Today I use the term Hebrew Bible and New Testament, not Old Testament, New Testament. But also well known of Marcion is that he published a 2-volume work that is referred to actually as the New Testament, in which there is a gospel text, in first place, the Evangelion, and 10 letters of Paul. So here's where you get the first instance of Pauline epistles. And that was given a name as well, a book given a name, Apostolikon. As I said, the significance, Evangelion and Apostolikon, I think, are significant. Those works too are lost, unfortunately, and both the Evangelion of Marcion and the Apostolikon, these 10 letters of Paul, have to be recreated from ancient sources, and the main sources there are Tertullian and Epiphanius. They're later, 3rd and 4th century writers who wrote extensively about Marcion and seemingly quoted from those works. So that's how scholars are able to piece it together. But it's not exact. It's taking some creativity as well. Also, I'd like to say it looks like Marcion had Jewish associations, and even someone like Marcus Vincent wrote an article that he was a proselyte Jew. I think that's important. And an issue that merits even more investigation. It makes sense of the references that we see, especially in the Apostolikon, to Jewish scriptures and Jewish allusions to Abraham. Marcion was clearly versed in Hebrew scriptures, so you have to ask, well, how did that happen? In a way, Hebrew scriptures, you might say, is maybe like the Homer of a Roman writer. So I do think there was some Jewish association there. Marcion is also thought to have been concerned about the status of the Jewish God and also Hebrew scriptures. The Apostolikon deals with the ongoing relevance of Jewish practices like circumcision for Gentiles specifically. And at the time of that 2-volume work, the Evangelion Apostolikon, there is no longer a Jewish kingdom, a Jewish state. Jerusalem is no longer. And Marcion is writing in Rome. So I think all of that plays a role in how we understand Marcion and how we understand the Evangelion and how we understand the Apostolikon, or the letters of Paul, the context, who he is and when he's writing and where he's writing. What does Marcion say about Pauline letters? I have little to report on this. We have indirect information. According to Tertullian, Marcion claimed, and this is not so much about Paul, but that he found the letter of Galatians. That's according to Tertullian. But what's interesting to me about that is this is precisely the kind of statement you would expect to see of a writer or an editor who's writing in the name of someone else. It's a cover, you might say. To say that you find a letter preserves a cover of authenticity, which is exactly what I think is at play here with the Pauline letters. They look like they're authentic. They're made to look authentic. So, and I also know that Marcion was highly criticized for focusing on only one apostle, Paul. So if you think about that, and you only had one gospel and the letters of Paul, you wouldn't know that there's any other letters. And indeed, there may not have actually been any other letters at the time of that publication, Marcion's publication.
You mean to tell me the golden plates that Joseph Smith found, he didn't write them? Sorry.
So I hope that answers.
Yeah, I certainly thought it did. Both and your previous answers, but that is interesting, isn't it? The Tertullian saying that Marcion found Galatians.
Yeah,
That is interesting. Did the canonical Pauline epistles come before or after Marcion's edition?
Thank you. This is an important question, and I know it's being debated now. I have adopted the view that the canonical epistles succeed or come later than the Marcionite collection, and that the authors of the canonical letters add information and even add additional letters. And maybe I can back this up a little bit. Do issues raised in the sources shed light on this question? The Marcion and canonical versions differ with regard to the character Timothy. In Acts, and I'm going to move to Acts here just momentarily, Paul is seen to circumcise Timothy, accommodating to Jews. Yet Titus, mentioned in Galatians, is not circumcised. In Acts, Timothy is a Jew-Gentile figure, like a liminal character, who accompanies Paul. The canonical Pauline letters then pick up on Timothy as Paul's co-worker. He is also a co-sender of several canonical Pauline letters. Yet the Marcionite letters, at least from the recreations that we have, make no mention of Timothy. So there's a little difference there with the character Timothy. It looks like the canonical letters are being changed to be closer to Acts, whereas the Marcionite set of letters has an Apostle Paul who remains squarely and more firmly in disagreement with the Paul of Acts. Otherwise put, the Marcionite Apostle Paul has no need or interest in this liminal or transitional character, Timothy. It doesn't mention Timothy, it mentions Titus, right? For another, Marcion's letter to the Romans is shorter. It ends at at the end of chapter 14. It lacks the two final chapters that are in the canonical version. 15 and 16 are in canonical, but not the Marcionite version of Romans. I would say then that those two chapters are added, although modern and ancient sources, even Origen, claim that Marcion excised or deleted those last two chapters of Romans. Of course, that was kind of the party line already from all these polemicists, that Marcion was deleting material. It looks like Origen is just repeating the party line, you might say. We know, however, that other New Testament writings had additional endings added. And I'm thinking here of the Gospels of Mark and the Gospel of John, and that's been known in scholarship for a long time. So it was a commonplace to add. The reason given for those additions, and there's even been scholarship on why adding, a rationale given, it's to harmonize with other New Testament writings. And I think you could use that same rationale with a longer ending of Romans, that it's harmonizing, trying to bring everything together in a canon that is all supposed to look similar and work together. Characters are working together. So that's one way that I would say that the Marcionite version is shorter and it was earlier. So I came across, and this may be applicable as well, this reference in Irenaeus, and I was looking at it just recently, and it may respond to this question as well. And it's a passage I cite in the book. In the passage, Irenaeus is criticizing the centrality of Paul for Marcion. Remember, I said Marcion's criticized because he only wants to deal with one apostle, Paul, or one character, really, Paul, with the letters. And so I'll just read a couple of lines here. Let Paul himself refute those who assert that he alone had knowledge of the truth, Paul, inasmuch as the mystery was manifested to him by revelation. For he said, Paul said, that one and the same God who worked through Peter for the mission to the circumcised worked also through himself for the Gentiles. And there Irenaeus is quoting from canonical Galatians 2:7-8. But what's interesting is when you look at the Marcionite recreated version of Galatians, that line about Peter is not there at all. So what is going on here? It looks like Irenaeus is making an argument against Marcion, but by means of a reference in a different version of Galatians. So it's kind of a dirty deal, you might say here. In other words, he's not playing fairly. So did someone else add to Galatians to assist Irenaeus in order to make that kind of a remark against Marcion? One could perhaps think that. So in other words, another possible way of saying that Marcion's work was earlier. Marcion's versions of the letters are earlier. And I'll also say that I worked on the opening formula or the opening address of the Pauline letters. I do quite a bit of that in the book. And so by comparison, however, to the Marcionite opening formulas, the canonical letter openings are more structured and formulaic. For canonical Romans, the opening is 7 verses long, and that is not in the Marcionite version at all. So it looks to me as though the individual's letters grew also stylistically and in conformity with one another, as another argument to say the canonical letters had more attention placed on them, and that to me makes it seem as though they're later. I hope that answers your question.
How do the Pauline epistles parallel Greco-Roman epistolary writings?
So in my book, I argue that the canonical Pauline letters do not conform well with common or everyday Greco-Roman correspondence, and I'm not going to go through that now. The everyday letters are thought to be occasional, ephemeral, here today, gone tomorrow. Pauline scholars, however, did compare Pauline letters to that type of Greco-Roman letter, and with little all-around success. But what I want to get across with the book is that Pauline letters have a comfortable home in what's known as pseudonymous letter collections. And it's that genre of letter that has even been characterized as very well known and very frequently used. But it's something that we're not taught. You know, graduate students aren't taught pseudonymous letter collections. It's rarely even considered. It's not considered, I would say, with regard to Pauline letters. So the first and necessary observation is that for them to fit with this category, pseudonymous letter collections, is that Pauline letters come to us as a collection. So, of course, the authentic perspective pushes against that notion because they're real letters. The authentic perspective doesn't think of Pauline letters as a collection. So the first thing one has to do is realize that the first evidence is as a collection, and then one is able to make these moves that I've made here with the pseudonymous letter collection parallel. So as a type of conceptual parallel, we have something similar to that collection of Pauline letters in Revelation, the book of Revelation, where we actually see a collection, but they're embedded letters. There's another parallel with those letters too, in that their addressees go to prominent cities. So there is some precedent, you might say, for the notion of a collection and even the notion of sending letters out widely. Those letters of Revelation were thought to go to the whole world when thought of symbolically. Pseudonymous letter collections, in contrast to Revelation, are standalone letters, and they're attributed to a well-known figure. And the collection gives that featured figure, in this case, the Apostle Paul, right, a solo voice, and they extend what is already known of that character. And Jacob, this is for you. And while they are literary fakes, according to modern epistolary theorists, they're not intended to maliciously deceive. Indeed, just the reverse. They're written to be plausible writings of the character. So this often employed term forgery is to me not a good descriptor, as it implies intent to deceive. And we have these scholars, Hindi Naiman and Irene Periano Garrison, who define pseudonymity, of which this is playing a role, as interpretive gesture, and where the author is less important. Remember, I said earlier that Marcion said he found Galatians. He wanted it to be Pauline, but he had no qualms about a letter being in Paul's name. That was the whole goal of it. It should be in Paul's name. So I say it's a nice fit because that Pauline letters are a nice fit to these pseudonymous letter collections, because we've got this character, Paul, and he is made famous in the book of Acts. He dramatically changes from a persecutor of Christ's communities to one of the strongest voices for the faith. And the last half of Acts, he's clearly the main figure, the protagonist. You might call him the hero of Acts. The letters, however, show a much more reasoned and reflective figure, and that's what these letters do. And the Apostle Paul engages in theological reasoning and teaching and moral exhortation. So you see a different character in the letters. And with letters, I also found a nice fit. You don't have to say all the Pauline letters. Here you can think of 13 letters. They don't have to all be said to have been by the same author. And here I'm talking about the actual author. And in fact, you often see many different authors with these kinds of letters. I don't want to make such a strong necessary fit, but it's a good conceptual way to shift the narrative, to think of them in another way. And there is a genre that is extant. It's existing. There are lots of pseudonymous letter collections. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. In fact, it looks possible and probable to me. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. The standard model is that Acts, or at least not even the standard, Bart Ehrman denies this. I've interviewed him on this, that Acts is using Paul's letters. But I would go with the mastermind himself, Pervo, and his commentary, and others who've documented this with McDonald and others. That they see there's too much going on between Acts and the letters, and that Acts is using Paul's letters. So my question is, if we're using this model that Acts comes first, for those who don't know, that's your position, what are details and this is a fun thought experiment,
Right.
in Pauline letters that show that they are derivative of Acts?
Yeah, this is a great question, and you're pushing me on this, which it's good to be pushed. Although I'm not encouraging you guys to push me too much. But so I've come up with a few comments for you. The first is, which I've already mentioned, the letters are ascribed to the Apostle Paul, and Paul is made known in Acts. So I could say that is number one. You need Acts before you can have the letters ascribed to that character. And there I'm following epistolary scholarship. But here's some more points I could contribute here. Acts deals with the lives of 12 apostles. Its Greek title is Praxis Apostolon. In actuality, it's really dealing with just a few apostles. Peter, who is legitimately an apostle, the main apostle in Acts. Paul's illegitimate, he's hardly an apostle. But it's largely about Peter. You see some with Philip and other characters, but not all 12 for sure. But for their part, the letters regard one apostle, barely identified as an apostle in Acts. In New Testament writings, the term apostle, well, given first a mention in the gospel texts, it receives much more attention, as you can imagine, in Acts, whose very title uses the word apostles. And if you do a search, you see the word apostles all over Acts. I mean, that's the main hit on that word for a search, okay? But to credit Pauline letters with the first written use of the term in the sense of apostle of Jesus Christ, to me seems unlikely. This is because the letters insist upon the title apostle for Paul. And so, just conceptually and logically, why would one insist on Paul being an apostle and an apostle of Jesus Christ if that notion is not already known from elsewhere? So that's something else that occurs to me with a precedent of the term apostles, which shows up in Acts. The dramatic period for both Acts and the letters of Paul is post-resurrection, right? They're both dealing with a post-resurrection world, right? And both of them then are talking about what comes next. So that's kind of the lay of the land for both of them. And there's steady state, you might say, even playing field. The dramatic setting and chronology of Acts, however, is different from that of the letters of Paul, and it appears primary or earlier, conceptually. So Acts describes the very beginning period, post-resurrection period, when there is opposition to the message from outsiders, largely from Jews. It tells how the message of Christ goes first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles amidst this resistance. Paul's speeches in Acts are explanatory of the basics of the message, and he 3 times, comes in the speeches as well, rehearses his conversion to the faith. So you see kind of basic information there. To me, this seems rudimentary about the faith. Acts itself in scholarship is characterized as a legitimating narrative. That's neither here nor there. I guess you could, it doesn't necessarily play into the chronology, but it plays into the basics of the story of Acts. The dramatic setting of the letters, however, assumes a different social situation, the life of the communities of faith. there's a conflict in the letters, just like there's conflict in Acts, but that comes from within the communities. That type of conflict implies, I think, a certain degree of stabilization, conceptually, a stabilization around the message, enough time for disputes and questions to arise, for instance. So the dramatic setting of the letters seems to me logically later than the events surrounding the character Paul in Acts. And I have a few more things I can add to this. 1 Thessalonians 2:14-15 look very much like it provides evidence of knowledge of Acts. Those are only loose, those full verses are not necessarily in the Marcionite version of Thessalonians, but there is reference to persecution. Those verses speak of Jewish persecution of Christ groups, which is very much a theme in Acts. Okay, I don't see where you'd find that other than in Acts. Galatians 1:13-14 is a brief reference to Paul's, or rather Saul's, persecution of Christ groups. And it, to me, seems to assume knowledge of a larger scenario as narrated 3 times in Acts. The canonical version of Galatians makes that assumption of Acts, the assumption of back knowledge of Acts, more explicit, as it overtly has the phrase, "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism." So, okay, to have heard that is huge in Acts, okay? So is that a shout out? Then you also have Galatians 1:17. The apostle knows of other apostles. Apostle Paul knows of other apostles in Jerusalem. That again is something, a theme in Act. You know that there's a church in Jerusalem and other apostles are there. There's figures within Pauline letters, Peter, James, or Jacob, and John, known also in Acts. So one can ask the same question: how would the apostle Paul of the letters in the 50s, which is in the historical perspective on the letters, how would he have known those characters were it not for Acts or a gospel? The travel itinerary, this is my last comment here, the travel itinerary of the Paul in Acts matches the addressees named within Pauline letters. So which is the earliest reference? So using the example of Corinth, one can see that Acts 18, we see a typical Acts motif in which Paul goes first to the synagogue, and the Jews oppose him, and then he goes to the Gentiles. And there he's going to a house, and he stays in this house for a year and a half teaching the word of God, but you don't get any information about what he's teaching. You don't get the content. You don't get anything. So we know, however, that there is a cell in Corinth, a Christ community in Corinth. And I think that's important as it set up. It's a good setup for the letters. The apostle has a relationship then to this Corinth. And there again, to me, it looks like Acts sets up a backstory that can then be redeployed by letters to the Corinthians, which are much more detailed about what's going on there in those communities from the point of view of Paul. So there's a few things.
Jacob, you mind if I make one comment about this fascinating observation real quick, and then
go ahead.
Let you take the wheel and drive the car the rest of the way. So I was pulling on some of these threads. You gave me the idea, and I was like, okay, hold on. What if we play this game? Let's flip it around and see if it looks like it might make better sense. And I came across some writings for Mark Bilby wrote an article with Anna Lefterow, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, where he shows, I think definitively, building on prior scholarship, of course, but they went a little further, that the narrative of Paul, specifically that he gets at the Areopagus, is actually modeled off of Orestes and Iphigenia, and they're both on trial in Athens. The interesting part is there ends up being this almost riot where they're trying to capture them and, of course, kill them in the Acts narrative. And this is echoed in that earlier 500 year earlier, 500 to 600 year earlier play by Aeschylus and, of course, Euripides. And like details, like it becomes shocking how similar some of the motifs are, right? And I think that this might be a literary antecedent, right? So your idea came to my mind, and I said, hold on. If I can anchor that Acts is dependent on earlier mythic material, whether it be Jewish scripture, Greek play and tragedy, or Homeric epic, you name it, Virgil, any of this stuff as a template, which would then put it away from historicity, clearly. And then I can look at the letters, and I see commonality or continuity in some way, shape, or form. What's more plausible? That an Acts narrator sees a literally 5 words in a sentence, or small sentence, and decides, I think I'm just going to write this long story based off this one little sentence, and I am going to anchor it in this earlier mythic motif, or that they wrote a powerful story that is echoed, like you said, with nods from this later epistolary fiction we call Paul's letters, almost like they know. And I found an interesting one. There's many, but I won't go into all of them here. I'll do a video on this. Is I wrestled with Beast at Ephesus. And scholars have scratched their head and said, hold on, he just drops this bomb and moves on? Like, who's these people? What happened? Well, you can go to Acts and you can read the story of the beast he wrestles in Ephesus. So it's not a definitive thing, but it's a great thought experiment. What if these are secondary? And if they are, can we take this outside of Acts and then apply this to the Gospels? And once we do that, we're in big trouble, because the rest of the world is like, they're all believing this chronology. Paul in the 50s, then you have the Gospels building off of that, and then they grant, okay, these other Pauline epistles that are fake know the Gospels and Acts. So they give like fake letters of Paul somewhat, but they can't shift their dominoes to make it fit, it seems. I don't know.
Yeah, Acts is extremely interesting, how it's put together and all the allusions it's making. It's really fascinating, and I think it's very important to telling the story, right, of early Christianity. I mean, you have to think, where would you be without Acts? That so much of the conceptuality of early Christianity comes from Acts. Right, and I do think it's mythic. The whole thing is mythic. But it's very important for the tradition, extremely important. And as I said, I think it's how we get the Apostle Paul. So that's the big shift that I make. That's how we get Paul.
It may solve the silence in Paul. We've always asked about, why is he not talking about Jesus' life? Why is he not narrating this? He doesn't need to. And so I personally think I get why positions like Richard Carrier come up and are trying to make sense of this absence of awareness of narrations and quotes of the Lord. It isn't necessary. The goal, and you already know this stuff. Why do I need to repeat what's already in these other texts when they may have been companions, especially if Marcion's Evangelion is complementary with the letters? And so they already know what they're reading here. Just a thought experiment. So
Right.
Sorry for jumping in again, Jacob.
No, interesting.
No problem at all.
But this does raise a question, and that is, based on what you said earlier about the use of Acts, or the parallels to Acts, is much more clear in the canonical edition than in the Marcionite edition. Do you think that Acts is situated between the Marcionite edition and the canonical edition?
I think it could be. I think that there is a lot of going back and forth there. and that Acts itself was being changed too. I mean, that could also be happening. As I said, this harmonization, when you get to the actual canonicity or canonical versions, things are moving around. So I do see where Acts played a role in the canonical versions, but I also see where the letters are pulling from Acts. Marcionite letters are pulling from Acts. That's, I guess, another reason why I think this Acts is very central. And it would make sense if you're trying to tell a cohesive story. You don't want to come up with brand new characters. You want to use a character that's already known, famous character. For instance, we have letters of Peter, right? A known character. So there was something about writing in the name of Paul because he's already there. He's an important person. So I don't know if that has answered your question. A roundabout way, perhaps, Jacob.
I thought you did. Do the Pauline texts provide internal clues that they were written much later in time than generally believed?
Thank you. So if we consider that the letters follow on Acts, and Acts is a 2nd century text, then yes, the letters themselves are later. As mentioned in the letters, Paul's an apostle, and this concept must have been developed before it could be used and have any kind of resonance in the letters. So there is something else, that notion of apostle. The letters also know of Christ resurrected, and they even know that a resurrection happened after 3 days. Okay. That information is known in a gospel text. Now, what I'm saying is perhaps controversial to a historical perspective. But if we're thinking this is literature, okay, then that 3 days is there already in a gospel text. And it's given a life there, right? A story, what happens in those 3 days. The letters pick up on it. Repeating some of what I said, Paul's knowledge of figures, such as Peter, James, and John, those are mentioned in the Marcionite material, Marcionite letters of Paul. They also derive, so I think that's anachronistic as well, from either a gospel or Acts. And in the book, I don't mention a lot of that stuff in the book that I just mentioned to you here. In the book, I talk about another issue, and I try to place it socially in a 2nd century context, and that's the issue of circumcision. That's chapter 4. I go into that in considerable detail. So in the letters, there's arguments, and perhaps the canonical, I'll grant this, have more sophisticated arguments against circumcision than the Marcionites, but certainly they're there in the Marcionites. That issue of the non-necessity of circumcision is there in the Marcionites. That issue doesn't appear, I argue in the book, until these arguments against circumcision don't appear until the 2nd century. And we see that in things like Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho and the Epistle of Barnabas. So that the way circumcision is being discussed, to me, is a signal of a 2nd century situation. It reflects a socio-political situation around the events of Bar Kokhba. And we also know that there was Roman legislation at that time, which may have even precipitated the war against what they call genital mutilation, but it was thought to also apply to circumcision. All of these issues are hot topics, you might say, at that time. And then going back to what I said earlier about Marcion, Marcion is writing from Rome under Roman rule, and there is no more Judea. That's gone. So circumcision is already problematic, you might say. The Jewishness of it has become problematic, especially among Romans, right? So that's another way in which I say that those letters fit nicely in a second century context.
If I may, Jacob, you brought this to my attention. Just a cool comment in the thought process that we've been thinking in here, Nina. Jacob was one of the ones who really made me. I knew about this in the past, but he nails me on this all the time. He'll hammer it, right? And when you hear it repeated, it makes you think. And that is 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 16, right? We always emphasize this point in this verse that says, the wrath of God has come upon them at last, right? Who's it talking about? The Jews. What's odd, in my opinion, is really that's like the icing on the cake of, I think, nodding to recognition of the temple, and or at least even Bar Kokhba, you could say. I mean, it could be the combination of both, but is in their effort to keep us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved. The Acts narrative is all about this. In this way, and it's not just in Acts, you kind of get this at least hinted at maybe in the Gospel of John, even though like Matthew's mission's mainly toward the Jews, there is a lot of Gentile kind of nods throughout these Gospels, but Acts really narrates it, right? So speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved, in this way, they always heap up their sins to the limit. The wrath of God has come upon them at last. I think this is a nod at how Acts narrates this, but Jacob made this point, and I thought, man, so we have two models that usually work in their minds. Well, they added this verse, this little insertion.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of it, we can anchor that. And I thought to myself, sure, interpolations happen. And yeah, but what's probably happening here is why not the easier, smoother, seemingly less ad hoc position? Exactly. And that is just, they're written later.
It's there. Yeah, it's already there.
There's
and that sounds so much like Justin Martyr. You deserve what's coming to you. That's Justin Martyr talking to Jews. Yeah. What happened? You deserve this. It's really strong. This suffering that you have. Yeah.
There's a verse in 1 Corinthians I've also pointed out for several years that in which it is being said, let's not worship God in buildings that are subject to the flames. That is some very strange talk for somebody supposedly writing before 70 AD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's weird. Mm-hmm.
That's why I definitely I'm of the mindset that the letters are after 70 AD. It makes more sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great.
Are Paul and his opponents in the epistles all fictional characters?
Well, I do see the letters as fictive and the situations posited there also as fictive. But his opponents is an interesting one. I also see the opponents as fictive as they're narrated there, and especially in Galatians, let's say. But it could point to actual opposition that's on the ground there. For instance, Marcion and the author of Acts, or Marcion and the Gospel of Luke, where there's differences of opinion. So there could have been actual opposition, and we know there's opposition. I mean, there's 4 different Gospels all taking a different take. So the opposition could be relying on something that is on the ground, but in terms of is it actual within the letters? I don't think so. I think it's for rhetorical effect, that opposition.
Why do you think the Pauline epistles were created? What was the purpose of them?
So the letters permit the development of doctrine or teachings and moral exhortation from an authoritative figure of the faith, rendered seemingly in his own voice. So one sentence. Okay, and that is how we really understand the letters. You know, it's funny, but I don't know that with that I'm saying anything extraordinary, other than to say, as you know, that I don't think they're real letters, but that it is to promote doctrine and teachings. And that's what they've done, right? They have been the source of the teachings. So I see a parallel reason even for other New Testament letters, for Peter and John and James and Jude or Judas. And we come to it secondarily. We're reading over the shoulder these letters. And to do that is interesting because it's seductive to read over the shoulder information that's not to you, but it's for somebody else. Like you're thinking, I'm finding out what Paul really said to these Corinthians. There's something interesting about that, right? It brings the reader in. And as one person, and he may have been hearing one of my earlier podcasts with you, Jacob, wrote to me afterwards with a whole write-up of how letters function. And he put it this way: a letter invites the reader into a vicarious experience, drawing her or him into a relationship that's already in progress. I thought that was kind of interesting. And it answers the question, why use a letter? Why make a letter? Why not just have the treatises of the Apostle Paul, right? So with the Pauline letters, and this is what I pick up in the book, my final point here, the addressees are communities of faith established in prominent ancient cities and regions. And this gives either a further impression of the success of the mission. Acts does that as well and says how many believers after, Peter made a speech and, thousands of people believed. You see that motif happening in Acts, but with letters going to prominent regions and many prominent regions, you also get that concept of the success of the mission and how widespread it is. So a letter allows that too, because it's seemingly going out, right? So finally, if this seems like a stretch, I will add that fictive letters were very common and highly popular in antiquity. This is something I learned, and it's not discussed at all in this scholarship on Pauline letters. So that's what I have.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to purchase Nina's book, The Letters of Paul in the Roman Literary Context, will be in the description below in the pinned comment. I'll also have Derek's YouTube channel tagged in the description below and also the link in the pinned comment. So if you haven't subscribed to his channel, you can click on either of those links and subscribe to his channel already. And that being said, Nina and Derek, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. It was fun.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. Great to see you, Derek and Jacob.
You as well.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. And this was fun. Yep. All right, everybody. I'll see y'all later. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.